O dabar tęsime mūsų darbą.
Well, now we continue our work, and I'm really glad that there is our guest from Latvia sitting next to me, who knows that the tradition of this conference will be kept next year as well. And I would like to introduce to you Dr. E Snore, who has a talent in quite a number of years. He's a historian, a film creator, and he is probably best known in Lithuania and in Europe in general for his exemplary film about Soviet crimes, which is a Soviet fairy tale or Soviet story we were watching last year. It was shown on Lithuanian national television. And I know that Mr. E Snore has further plans as well. He's working on Ukrainian Holodomor issues at the moment. And his presentation will be related namely with this painful historical event. And I would like to add that it is important not only to analyze events after they happen. It is also very important to follow the reaction of the world when things are happening. And we have to recognize that crimes against humanity have been occurring for hundreds and thousands of years, and they haven't disappeared after the Second World War, and the genocide, Soviet genocide, was not the last crime. Certainly we have to put every effort to avoid such crimes in the future, and the most essential is how the civilized world, which we are a part of, react upon these events, whether we take any action when the crime is committed against someone further from us. So Edwin is writing his thesis on this particular topic, and he agreed to share his ideas with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you very much for inviting to participate in this conference. The presentation which I will give is about quite specific subject, which is the Western attitude towards the Holodomor in the early 1930s. In the winter of 1932-33, an estimated 3.5 to 7 million people died as a result of the man-made famine in Ukraine. A number of scholars had characterized it as genocide. One of them, the Jewish scholar Raphael Lemkin, who in 1944 coined the very term genocide. In 1948, he became also an author of the UN's definition of the term genocide. He himself was from Ukraine, and he believed what happened in Ukraine in 1933 was a deliberate destruction of Ukrainian nation, and that it was a genocide. Although the scale and character of the Holodomor was widely known in the West at that time, the reaction to it was quite weak, and in fact the grain which was collected forcibly from the Ukrainian farmers was exported to the West. In this presentation, I will look at the role of the Western public opinion in shaping the official reaction of the Western governments towards the Holodomor at that time in 1932-33. First of all, it is important to establish what kind of information about the Soviet actions in Ukraine was there in the West at that time, in the early 1930s. And based on that information afterwards, also come to try to draw what kind of conclusions could be made at that time regarding the actual causes, scale, and character of the Great Famine. It must be emphasized that the Soviet regime did everything in its power to deny the existence of the famine. For example, when the Western press reported the Soviet purchase of grain abroad to alleviate their food shortages at home, Pravda published a denial, and Stalin denied the existence of the famine and continued to export grain. However, it was not possible to completely conceal the fact of famine from the world. By reviewing digital archives of newspapers from such countries as Great Britain, Canada, France, America, Switzerland, Norway, and the Baltic states, one clearly sees that during the period of 1932-33, they published several hundreds of articles, letters to the editor, and other publications relating to the famine in the USSR and the Soviet economic policies connected to it. Paradoxically, the most detailed information about these things and about the developments in the Soviet Union was provided by those Western correspondents who were stationed outside the USSR, usually in the neighboring Baltic states. For example, journalists from such influential newspapers as the British Times, the American Chicago Daily Tribune, or the French Journal de Débat, reported on the Ukrainian famine from Riga in Latvia. Being outside the USSR, they were not influenced by the Soviet censorship and intimidation, which was frequently experienced by the foreign correspondents stationed in the Soviet Union. During the Ukrainian famine in the early 1930s, the number of Western correspondents in Moscow was comparatively small in comparison to the foreign press representation in other European capitals. Given the huge size of the Soviet territory, it was nearly impossible for them to adequately cover all the newsworthy events which took place in the USSR. By analyzing their writings, we can see that they wrote very little about the famine in Ukraine. One of the main reasons for that was the fact that the Soviet authorities forbid the Western travelers and correspondents to go to Ukraine and the North Caucasus exactly during the famine, which is from February to September 1933. Several of them, however, managed to travel to Ukraine, observed the horrific famine conditions firsthand, and later described them in the Western press. One of the most notable was the British Malcolm Muggeridge, a correspondent of the liberal Manchester Guardian, who was initially himself a pro-Soviet and who was impressed by the Soviet system. But after his trip to Ukraine in early 1933, he changed his opinion completely. Muggeridge sent his reports from Ukraine by diplomatic mail in order to bypass Soviet censorship. They were published in a series of articles in March of 1933. Muggeridge, therefore, is considered to be the first Western correspondent who made the Great Famine in Ukraine known to the wider world. He described, it is interesting that he described not only the horrific conditions of the peasants in Ukraine, but also emphasized the character and the causes of that famine. And he specifically noted, for example, that the famine was an organized one. He wrote that. The same conclusions were drawn also by some other notable correspondents, for example, Gareth Jones, who also was one of the few who visited Ukraine at the height of famine in March 1933, and who confirmed Muggeridge's account. Moscow's reaction to that was swift, and both journalists were expelled from the Soviet Union, and any reports and news about the famine were labeled as lies. It must be noted that Kremlin's position was supported and reiterated also by many Western intellectuals and journalists who also denied the existence of the famine in Ukraine. One of the most well-known is the infamous Moscow correspondent of the New York Times, Walter Duranty, who dismissed the famine reports of Jones and Magaridge as inaccurate and untrue. He also justified the Soviet genocidal policies, saying that you cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs. In private, however, Duranty fully acknowledged the existence of the famine and even estimated the number of its victims as high as 10 million. But in public, as I said, he said nothing about it. For his news correspondence from Moscow, Duranty was even awarded the Pulitzer Prize. As being the correspondent of the best American newspaper, Duranty was instrumental in shaping American opinion about the Soviet Union, and he was also instrumental in concealing the famine from the world. The Western public opinion in general was sympathetic to the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, and not only because of the Soviet propaganda, but also because it was a depression period with huge unemployment and severe economic hardships, and it was favorable for left-wing ideas. Many were convinced that the Great Depression signaled the final days of capitalism and that the solution lied in the Soviet form of planned economy. It is not very well known that today, it is not very well known that in the early 1930s, tens of thousands of Western European and American workers, fooled by the Soviet propaganda, emigrated to the USSR in search for better life. Their fate was quite tragic, and by 1940, most of them were already dead. Hiding the fact of famine from the West was of utmost importance for Stalin, both from political and economical reasons. The Soviet Union spared no effort to do it, to hide the famine. Many Western newspapers and intellectuals were bribed by the Soviets to ensure friendly coverage of the Soviet affairs. For example, the renowned French writer Romain Rolland was paid 5,000 francs a month by the Soviet embassy in Paris. It is not surprising, therefore, that he dismissed the notion of the famine in Ukraine, saying that I don't want to hear anything about it. I care about much greater misfortune, Hitlerism. Similar attitude towards the Ukrainian famine was propagated also by such Western celebrities as the Nobel Prize laureate Bernard Shaw, the British labor activists Lord and Lady Pasfields, and others who denied the famine even after visiting Ukraine. Soviet propaganda spread their views, like of Bernard Shaw and Pasfields, spread their views as widely as possible, both abroad and within the USSR. And Gareth Jones, who was in the Soviet Union, as I said, in 1933, wrote that after Stalin, the most hated man in Russia is Bernard Shaw. To many of those who can read and have read his descriptions of plentiful food in their starving land, the future is blacker than the present. The biggest Soviet propaganda victory in light of the famine was the visit of the French Prime Minister Edouard Herriot to the Soviet Union in the fall of 1933. He was taken on a guided tour through Ukraine and was shown a Potyomkin's village spectacle with plump farmers in Ukrainian national costumes and abundance of food everywhere. After his visit, Erio declared that there was no famine in Ukraine and that it was a product of Nazi propaganda. Erio was a highly respected politician in the West, and his remarks had a serious effect on the public perception of the Ukrainian famine in the West. Although many called him a liar and a caviar victim of the Soviets, many more believed in what he said, and British diplomats, after his visit, concluded that the Soviet organizations can now do anything they like in or outside the Soviet Union, as the majority of educated and responsible opinion in Europe and America is simply incredulous of the criticism of the Soviet Union. Eriot's remarks and the overall pro-Soviet atmosphere of the 1930s left a detrimental effect also on the famine relief efforts organized by various Ukrainian organizations in the West and by such figures as Amende, Viennese Cardinal Innitzer, and others. Many of the donors and supporters gradually shied away from the aid campaign. The International Red Cross, for example, also was quite reluctant to take any practical action to organize famine relief in Ukraine. In conclusion, it can be said that in 1932-33, the Western public was comparatively well informed about the scale and character of the famine in the Ukraine. The Western press published many news reports and analyses on this subject, and even more detailed information about the famine conditions in Ukraine were in possession of the Western governments, especially the German, Italian, Polish, those who had their representatives, diplomatic representatives in Ukraine. In 1933, one can also observe increased activity on the part of the Soviet propaganda. After the first famine reports, there were an upsurge of publications in the Western press, particularly in the Manchester Guardian and some other liberal newspapers, denying the fact of famine, both in the USSR and Ukraine in particular. Public denial of the famine by renowned and highly respected figures in the West contributed greatly to the mixed and largely indifferent reaction of the West to the reported deadly famine conditions in the USSR. Thank you.
Ačiū.
Thank you, Edwin Snore, for your interesting presentation about the phenomenon, historical event, which hasn't been fully investigated so far, conducted by the Soviet Union on the territory of today's Ukraine. I believe we will have questions, but I suggest that we leave these questions for the general discussion after we hear our third presenter.